So for our closing session, we're going to discuss the legacy of international intervention in Iraq. And we wanted to have a dedicated session on this topic, partly so that we could, in fact, spend most of the day discussing Iraq itself. It is somewhat distasteful when the was it worth it and 10 years on debate in the UK and in the US does at times become rather obsessed with ourselves and the domestic politics around some of these decisions. It's been wonderful today to have so many Iraqis and British Iraqis here, both as speakers and in the audience, people who've taken the time to come from Iraq, particularly from Baghdad, to come and be here with us. And I would like to echo the point that Claire made about the importance of the diaspora. One of the criticisms that, of course, was made about the intelligence gathering in the run-up to the invasion was about a reliance on diaspora that was, to some extent, arguably disconnected from things that were changing on the ground in Iraq. I think that today there's been a huge amount, almost an excess of analysis about the role of social media in the Arab Spring, but there's perhaps a fertile avenue for research on the role in which social media is playing in reconfiguring diaspora and changing those relationships between exiles and diaspora and their countries of origin, because it's much easier today to stay connected. I think some of you who perhaps yourselves were exiles back in the 1980s would have lost contact really with families and friends in Iraq. And today the level of connectivity between diaspora and exile groups in the home countries is much, much greater. And you can see in all sorts of Twitter hashtags we've been using today, Iraq 10 years on. You can also look, for instance, at hashtag Twitter Kurds, a really interesting interplay of discussions taking place in different parts of the world all at once. So thanks again to all of you for participating in that. And in this session, we will look at the broader implications for the West and the world of the experience of the intervention in Iraq. Firstly, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kanan Makiya from Brandeis University. Born in Baghdad and studied architecture at MIT, Professor Kanan is the author of several books, including Republic of Fear and Cruelty and Silence, some of the first books that really cast light on the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime. Since 2003, he's founded the Iraqi Memory Foundation, which is dedicated to collecting archives and accounts of Iraq's history that might otherwise be lost. Professor Kanan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for inviting me. When first asked to address this conference, I asked to speak on the relationship between the birth or the origins of the Arab Spring of, so-called Arab Spring of January 2011 and the 2003 war in Iraq, or what is perhaps more relevant to call, for the purposes of my comments here, the overthrow by war of the regime of Saddam Hussein. My contention, and this may no doubt, perhaps some people will disagree, and I look forward to a discussion, is that there is a very close connection between these two major cataclysmic events. One that has been overlooked, due in large part to the perfectly understandable hostility that the 2003 Iraq war engendered in Western and Arab, but non-Iraqi, I might add, eyes. A hostility that was largely, though not completely, of course, not there at the time of the war itself, at the time of military action in 2003. A prime consequence of this hostility is the fact that none of the prime Arab actors on the ground during the Arab Spring, be it in Tunisia, Egypt, or Syria, and by actors I mean the brave men and women doing all the protesting and the dying on the streets, I mean that they themselves did not see a connection or have been willing to admit that the possibility that there might be one. And just the opposite, in fact. While Kanan, perhaps known to many of you as the Facebook activist, emphatically denied any such connection between the things he did, very brave things he did, and the earlier events in Iraq. In fact, such activists like Weil vociferously denied, specifically denied, that their own demands for reform and/or revolution had anything to do with the international war that they by and large all saw as illegitimate or even imperialistic in nature. As the Arab Spring progressed, such denials became somewhat less vociferous and even began to disappear among Libyans and Syrians, for example, who were now calling for the very intervention that they had so fiercely opposed back in 1991 and 2003. I could entertain you with anecdotes of Syrian intellectuals who were furious with me for a book like Cruelty and Silence, published in 1993, which tried to justify that intervention, rightly or wrongly, whatever the case may be, and who are now trying to invite me to parties and things, and with questions like, what was the best way of getting Stinger missiles off the Americans? Not that I have the foggiest idea how to go about doing that, but you know, they seem to imagine that I did. To understand whether or not a connection exists between the overthrow of Saddam and the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, one must accept that the 2003 war did not come out of nowhere. The events leading up to it began when the Ba'ath regime in Baghdad marched into Kuwait in August of 1990. Why, I think we must ask in an audience like this, was what we must ask was the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq all about? And I would answer that question by saying it was essentially about a restoration of the Arab state system, a system that we all know was set up for the most part artificially, to be sure, by Western powers, Britain and France largely, after World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. This system of states, this order, call it that, was violated for the first time in 80 years from within, first of all, by Saddam Hussein, when he invaded, occupied, annexed, and systematically raped the state of Kuwait starting in August 1990. Nothing like this had ever happened before in Arab politics. For sure, there had been intervention by Nasser's Egypt in the Yemen, and there had been the intervention of Hafez Assad during the Lebanese Civil War. But it paled in comparison with the magnitude of the action that Saddam took, which was essentially to wipe out a member of the state system, and that was something you didn't do. Needless to say, in one Arab country after the next, since the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring, and I only use that phrase because that is the easiest way to capture in a nutshell, seems to be a commonly agreed upon phrase for the extraordinary events that have been unfolding since January 2011. The weaknesses of that system of states, or post-World War I order, if I might call it that, first exposed, as I said, by Saddam's actions in 1990, are continuing to make themselves felt with countries like Libya, Syria, and Iraq, teetering on the edge of falling apart, to be honest, or looking increasingly not viable or even coherent within their current borders. In fact, one could go so far as to say that the diplomatic, economic, and military support that several key states are today providing to Syrian resistance forces fighting against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, a support they very reluctantly gave to the coalition that pushed Saddam out of Kuwait, and only because their own security was at stake, and a support that they were most unwilling to give in the wake of the Iraqi dictator's overthrow in 2003, when a new and more equitable order, let's not even call it democratic, was at least on the agenda in Iraq. This support by Arab states to the Syrian opposition dramatically casts light, it seems to me, on an emerging reconfiguration affecting the larger Middle East. Arab states have entered into a proxy conflict with a regime that had advertised itself and founded its very legitimation upon an anti-American, anti-Israel rhetoric and rejection front, comprising and it comprised a rejection front that comprised the Iranian regime, Assad-ruled Syria, and Hezbollah. I contend there is something very new going on here. Not exactly sure what it means, but it is strikingly new and different. In its novelty, one can see that the whole Arab order, as it has held itself together since 1967, at least, it seems to me is falling apart. This may take a very long time. I'm not predicting imminent demise tomorrow. I am saying we are seeing an order unravel, come apart in front of our eyes. Now, there is normally very little that is positive or good to be said about the collapse of states like Syria and Iraq. It is often, and certainly in the Syrian case, a recipe for death and destruction unmatched by anything caused by state-to-state wars of the sort of which we have had many in the modern Middle East. History has shown us this time and time again. There is one partial exception to this dismal story, and you thought that Sami was being depressing. You don't expect any relief from me. And that exception is the one that was briefly alluded to in an earlier panel, and Gareth spoke to it. And that is the fate of the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, and tomorrow, I very much expect, in other parts of the Kurdish-dominated region. The Kurds, remember, were the great losers of post-Ottoman Middle Eastern state order, post-World War I. But that is no longer the case. If what is happening in Iraq today is anything to go by. The only part of Iraq that is working, in quotation marks, and I don't mean it's perfect, and I don't mean it's not full of all kinds of rife with corruption and all kinds of other problems, but the only part of Iraq that is working today, both in security terms and economically, is Iraqi Kurdistan. And that in itself is a very interesting conundrum, the meaning of which is worth pondering about. But I digress. That's not the main purpose of my talk. If the 1991 war was about a restoration of the Arab state system, as I called it, the 2003 war, by contrast, called its very legitimacy into question. With the toppling of the most egregious tyrant the modern Arab world has ever known, Saddam Hussein, one who had survived numerous wars and killed untold millions of people, the whole order of which he was such an integral part came under a new kind of scrutiny. The idea that all the ills of our Arab societies are attributable to abstractions like imperialism and Zionism, an idea that stood at the center of Arab political culture, in the realm of ideas, values, since the great defeat of 1967, and that had filled the heads of Arab intellectuals with arid nonsense to the exclusion of anything more productive. This whole outlook on the world now had to rub up against the realities of what life under Saddam Hussein had been really like. You did not have to agree with the war or like the nasty, selfish, and sectarian new political elite that American force of arms put in power in Iraq to see that something truly awful had been in control of this poor country previously, and that generations had paid with their futures and with their lives because of it. The nastiness of the Ba'ath experience in Iraq, the 30-year-long experience, it was clear, did not come from outside. It came from within, from what Arabs had constructed for themselves as states and systems of states in the last half a century or so. Now, ideas are not constrained by frontiers and borders. Youth, in particular in the Arab world, are not constrained by the prejudices of older generations, in particular of my generation's prejudices and compromises with dictatorship, of which we all participated in one form or another. And so, in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria, a new phenomenon made its appearance, one that unified the diverse constituencies of these very different countries, the demand for a political order deriving its legitimacy from something and somewhere new, somewhere other than the need to be unified in a suffocating nationalist embrace to hold in check the so-called avaricious intentions of the United States and Israel. But what to look for as a replacement? Why not a politics that looked to citizenship and the will of individual citizens? Nothing else has worked in the Arab world after all, and not for lack of trying. It is, of course, far from clear what kinds of government will eventually emerge from the crucible of the current popular revolts. Again, post-2003 Iraq is an interesting dress rehearsal to examine and address carefully what might occur in other parts of the Arab world. Iraq sits on a knife edge of a breakup. Let us not be fooled by the apparent continuity of the state. 14 car bombs went off just today. I just barely caught the news coming in, quite apart from everything else that went on. This might very well be a dress rehearsal, as I said, this experience from 2003 to 2010, for what we may look forward to, alas, in a country like Syria. Once again, we seem to have returned to a situation in which the fate of the whole region rests on the fate of its individual parts. I certainly think, if we're talking about a future for Iraq, it will or will not have a future, with the exception of Kurdistan that I've already mentioned, and depending this time in part on what happens in countries like Syria and Iran. And what will happen in those countries is anyone's guess. We may very well be facing years, perhaps even a decade or two, of turmoil and violence before things begin to settle down in these countries, that is, if they remain countries. Now, none of this is the main point of my talk, was caused by international intervention in Iraq, by the good idea or the bad idea of the 2003 war. It arises fundamentally from the crisis-ridden, and I would even say rotten, structures of Arab politics and political culture. It arises from a cycle of decline in the Arab world that can be dated back to 1967. All that we can say with certainty is something new is replacing it. It is falling apart. What that new thing is, I don't think anyone knows. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kanan. We'll turn now to Professor Rosemary Hollis, who will be familiar to many of you as she was formerly the Director of Research and the Director of the Middle East Programme here at Chatham House, now a Professor of Middle East Politics at City University and the author of the book Britain and the Middle East in the 9/11 Era. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The personal lesson that I took from the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the limits of civil society platforms in the UK and the beginning of a continuing frustration with the political elite in this country, which we've heard echoed across the Middle East and in particular in Iraq. During the course of today, the problem would seem to be for all of us with our politicians. And maybe that is our responsibility, taking something from Professor Makiya's eloquent presentation right now. Since I can't say most of what I would like to dwell on 10 years on, I'm choosing 2 lessons in particular to be drawn from the 2003 invasion experience as a Brit, and I'm not a professor of Middle East politics, I'm a professor of Middle East policy studies. I specialize on tracking what the Brits, the European Union, the Americans do and have done in the Middle East, and how our pasts and futures are so intertwined. So 2 lessons and 2 thoughts on what all of this means vis-a-vis how we're Westerners and Britain in particular are reacting to the current situation in the Middle East and Syria in particular. So, apart from anything else, I would say that the most important lessons to be drawn from the Iraq experience were that the intelligence failure about weapons of mass destruction discredited not just the intelligence community per se, but also the credibility of politicians. The way that intelligence was spun, misrepresented, overinterpreted, instrumentalized. Secondly, that, and this Rory Stewart makes very plain in his book, occupiers are not welcome anywhere. And anywhere, within a period of time, shorter or longer, they breed resistance. I recommend to you the film about Israel's Shin Bet called The Gatekeeper, which I saw last night. It is riveting. And they are basically the leaders of the Israeli intelligence agency, internal intelligence agency, responsible for policing the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza since 1967, making the point that you don't do that and not expect resistance and terrorism. And let's remember the Israelis going into Lebanon, originally welcomed, and then worst enemies, and on and on. So if you're going to invade a country, don't expect to be liked, and anticipate that commendable, brave, well-trained armed forces will still mess up. And that revenge dynamics build within small communities and affect even the best. So good intentions are not going to be enough to get you through. And all of that should tell us, and we have learned over the past 10 years, the limits of force. And if you remember, the Americans were saying, when we went into Iraq, that they do regime change, but they don't do nation building. There has been a massive rethink on that in the last 10 years, much consideration given to the importance of, if you are going to change a regime by force, that is just the beginning. And that there is therefore an undertaking which involves the civilian sector. And none of the countries in the West, the United States included, is equipped with the kind of civil service machinery or draft of a civil service machinery that can import a nation-building project into anybody else's country. And of course, we know that if you want democracy in that country, it has to be from the grassroots. It also cannot be imported. So the limits of force, as well as the problem of intelligence, which discredits the politicians, and the net effect of all of this on the local population and how they will respond. Given the costs, given the lessons, my perception is that nobody around here wants to do an Iraq again. But the subsequent Arab uprisings have revealed that, lo and behold, the Arabs, just as much as anybody else, doesn't put up they, as a people, populations of Arab states, do not put up with oppression and indignity indefinitely. And yes, that they do want democracy. If you remember, the neocons said if you scratch anybody, you'll find a Democrat inside. And then there was all the debate about, well, actually, you don't just have to topple a dictator, you have to build a democracy. But I don't think we ever quite got to the other end of the discussion about what role for outsiders in the growth of democracy anywhere. And I also detect, and I'm nearing the end of my thoughts, I also detect that the urge to intervene, the urge to help, make a difference, save lives, has not gone away. And personally, I think, insofar as that is present now with the UK government, that urge to intervene having not gone away, it worries me. And there is a little noblesse oblige, we know best, extraordinary assumption that what has happened in the West makes Westerners experts at doing regime change, nation building, and all the rest of it, given all the evidence to the contrary. And this urge to intervene, including by force, was demonstrated in Libya, from which, on a platform here, I remember we discussed, we can deduce that much as the British Prime Minister and the French President took the lead, and the Americans so-called led from behind, without the American contribution, the rebels would not have succeeded in Libya. But because of the 3/4 or only half-learned lessons of Iraq, there is no appetite for the nation building, for the we helped break it, we've got to fix it, follow through afterwards. So Libya is struggling to make the most of this. And what we have now, looking at Syria, the half or 3/4 learned lessons of Iraq mean that there has been no overt Western intervention so far, including the lessons learned by the Russians from Libya to prevent another Western adventure in the Arab world. But I wondered how long people here would have the stomach to watch the carnage and not feel that urge, well, if we wade in, we can make it better. Now, I'm asking you all, help me understand how Western intervention, UK intervention in the name of bouncing the US into intervention in Syria is somehow going to save lives. If saving lives were what you were about in Iraq, then you wouldn't have invaded. If saving lives is what you're about in Syria, how is the use of force, taking sides in that war, going to save lives? All it will do is take sides in the war. And that's what I foresee as on the cards. And I think, in a way, that is the story of not just Iraq, but Britain and the Middle East, since the 1920s, if not before, taking sides.
Thank you. So for our final panel speaker of the day, we have a historian, and I'm surrounded by professors here. We have Captain Jeffrey Macris, a permanent military professor in the history department at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, and the author of 2 books on the role of the great powers in the Persian Gulf region. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jane. Washington requires me to start off with a disclaimer that my discussion today represent my own views and not necessarily those of the U.S. government, the U.S. Naval Academy, or the U.S. Navy. So, I'm serious, they do. With that, we've heard quite a bit today about the year 2013 representing the 10-year anniversary of the 2003 invasion. But what we haven't heard, and what I as a historian would like to talk about today, and some of the lessons learned, about some of the other anniversaries that involve the great powers, notably Washington and London, and their involvement in the Gulf region and Iraq. It's been 22 years, for example, since Desert Storm in 1991, 42 years since the British withdrew from the Gulf Arab Emirates, setting them independent in 1971, 55 years since the 1958 revolution that ended the British-backed Hashemite monarchy, 72 years since Britain invaded Iraq in World War II to get rid of the Golden Square that had installed a British or a German-leaning regime in Baghdad. Also that same year, the first large-scale American deployment of military force into the Gulf, when Washington deployed 60,000 troops to Iran and Iraq to help deliver Lend-Lease equipment through Iran and Iraq up to Russia. 96 years since the British in World War I stormed ashore in Mesopotamia and in Persia, first to protect their oil refinery at Abadan, and then later to move up the Tigris Valley to capture Baghdad from the Ottomans, beginning the British Mandate of Iraq. 200 years since Britain deployed their warships and diplomats to the Gulf to quell tribal disorder that threatened interstate stability, starting their overlordship in the 1800s of the British or of the Gulf Sheikdoms. And then finally, 506 years since the Portuguese Admiral Albuquerque in 1507 first entered the Gulf, marking the start of 5 centuries of on and off Western political and military presence in the Gulf region. So, there's been a long, long legacy of Western political and military influence in Iraq and in the greater Gulf. And as we look at Iraq 10 years after 2003 invasion, we ought to ask ourselves what military lessons from the past might illuminate the present and the future. And I'd suggest there are 4 lessons. First, despite the vast oil resources of Iraq, which perhaps might be the second largest in all the world, the West's involvement in Iraq and in the greater Gulf region has never simply been about oil. It's been about location. If it were only about petroleum, the West wouldn't have been here for 400 years before the dawn of the oil age. Rather, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, and now the Americans have been drawn to the region, in large part because it lies at the crossroads of 3 great continents. Here you see it right here, of Africa and Europe and of Asia. People and trade have been moving through or near Mesopotamia since the very dawn of civilization, as they do today. So what happens in Iraq, the stability of that country and the nations around it then, remain of great concern to the outside great powers. That was true at the dawn of the Age of Discovery with the Portuguese, and it remains true today. Which leads me to my second assertion. The political complexion of the Gulf is anarchic, and it requires an outside superpower to police the region there and to maintain order. I use the term anarchic as the political scientist does today, meaning a place where there exists no dominant power that can prevail over all of the other states to resolve disputes and to enforce the law. Today, as in previous centuries, the Gulf is marked by 3 local powers: Shia Iran, or Persia, Sunni Saudi Arabia, and Arab Shia Sunni Iraq, none of whom particularly see eye to eye with each other. These 3 states over the past centuries have engaged in a continuing struggle against each other, with their relative power waxing and waning over time. To this inherently unsettled mix of regional powers, we must also consider the destabilizing presence there of several extremely wealthy yet extremely weak emirates: Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, and Oman. Their very independence stemmed from Britain's presence in the region in the 1800s and 1900s. Without London, Kuwait almost certainly would have been subsumed by the Ottomans or by the Iraqis, the UAE and Qatar probably by the Saudis, Bahrain by either the Saudis or the Iranians. A look at the British archives in the 1800s and 1900s shows tens of thousands of pages of stories of British diplomats attempting to mediate border disputes and impose truces and treaties amongst the tribes and states of the region, using modest applications of British political pressure and, when needed, military power, primarily naval power, to keep the peace. Britain, in other words, had assumed the role of a policeman to achieve a Pax Britannica, or a British-imposed peace. That Pax Britannica, however, ended with the British withdrawal east of Suez in 1971. A reluctant America, mired in a hot war in Vietnam and a cold war everywhere else around the globe, it seemed, adamantly refused to assume Britain's former role as a security guarantor in the Gulf, and 2 decades of political bedlam ensued. With no outside power to help police the region, the Iran-Iraq border flared, the Shah tumbled, the emboldened Russians invaded Afghanistan, and the Iraqis took Kuwait. And after each of these foreign policy catastrophes, at least from the perspective of the West, that followed Britain's 1971 withdrawal, the Americans felt themselves compelled to assume an ever-increasing role in the Gulf, culminating in the 1991 Gulf War, after which the US military stayed, maintaining interstate order there, as well as maintaining the free flow of trade in and out of the region. Washington then, since 1991, in other words, had assumed Britain's former duty as security guarantor. For there to be enduring interstate peace in the region, in this inherently unstable region, in my opinion, an outside power is needed. That's my second key point, which leads me to my third point. If a superpower presence is required in the Gulf to prevent interstate violence and to keep interstate trade, free trade around the globe flowing, and it is, what should that presence look like, and where should it be placed? Well, here, we need to assume that the future goals of the West remain the same as they have been in the past. Continued political stability and the free flow of world commerce. In short, to maintain those interests, the West in the future should maintain an integrated coalition of Western and Arab militaries and political states. And the West should project power to those states in the Gulf region whose leaders want or need it, and stay away from those who don't. Let me explain. Which state want superpower presence inside their borders? Well, the minor emirates do. Those same states whose initial independence arose from the good favor of the superpowers and whose continued independence depends upon the protection of the superpowers: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. Why not deploy forces in the larger regional powers, including Iraq? Well, because Western presence there has, over the past century through history, engendered a strong political backlash. Britain's mandate in Iraq, for example, was never particularly popular. The Arab revolt in 1920, even before the installation of the Hashemite King Faisal in Iraq, presaged 3 more decades of anti-Western protests that culminated in the 1958 army-led revolution that took down the British-friendly king. We saw similar antipathy in that vein directed toward the Americans to a degree shortly after the 2003 invasion until their departure in 2011. In neighboring Iran, furthermore, we all know of the ferocity that swept away the Shah, its Persian population in part animated by the monarch's tight connections with Washington. And in Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, throughout the last years of his life, fought assiduously to prevent the Americans from planting a foothold in his conservative kingdom, a move that he believed would stir up violent opposition from conservative members of his nation. In the aftermath of 1991's Desert Storm, in that vein, we saw such a conservative reaction when American flyers stayed in that desert kingdom to help enforce a no-fly zone against Saddam. A fierce opposition movement arose within the kingdom, with the then little-known Osama bin Laden condemning Saudi leaders for consorting with Washington, the great Satan. So any attempt by the West to deploy sustained military force to these 3 powerful local powers, of course, Iran, it would never happen, but in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia, would almost certainly end poorly for Western interests. So what would such a stabilizing, in my view, Western military force in the Gulf region consist of? And as we said, it needs to be multinational, with Western forces and Arab forces working hand in hand. And again, if history is a guide, a large standing land-based military garrison would not only not be necessary, it would be counterproductive to Western interests. Rather, in the future, a relatively modest amount of military power is sufficient, just like a lightly armed policeman walking the beat of a neighborhood block normally dissuades problems in a neighborhood. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, such a British presence tended to be mostly naval, and in general, a naval presence provides a show of resolve, but with a very small footprint ashore. But such a naval force must also be backed up with the credible threat of a much larger land invasion force looming from over the horizon. So, my third key idea is that to fulfill London and Washington's greater national interests, interstate stability, and the free trade to, from, and through the region, we should rely on a small military footprint that emphasizes naval power, eschewing a large presence in the Arab regional powers, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, for such a presence would elicit a counterproductive backlash. Which leads me to my fourth and final point today. We should be very, very careful about attempting to fundamentally change the nature of foreign societies. Some of them in this region represent, after all, the oldest in the world. When Western powers over the past century worked in the Gulf toward narrowly maintaining their two enduring interests in the Gulf, preventing interstate aggression and furthering trade, they succeeded. Where we have fallen into a trap, in my opinion, is in our Western quest, a well-intentioned quest, to be sure, of attempting to reshape these societies in a Western image. In doing so, we have assumed, wrongly, in my opinion, that Western ideals are universal ideals that can be quickly and easily transplanted into foreign cultures. When the British overthrew Turkish rule in Mesopotamia in World War I and installed a Hashemite monarch on the throne, they were, in a somewhat altruistic way, attempting to bring an enlightened Western order to a population that had previously known Eastern despotism. And 8 decades later, in 2003, in a similar vein, when the Americans overthrew another Middle Eastern despot, Saddam, Washington did so in part to bring a new democratic order to Iraq. So, in summary, the Western powers have played a very long role in the affairs of the Gulf region and in Iraq. From the time of the Portuguese 500 years ago, to the arrival of the British in the 1800s, to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. In my mind, a long legacy of Anglo-American political and military involvement in the region offers 4 lessons. Well, first, the West's involvement in Iraq and the greater Gulf region has never simply been about oil. It's about location, one of the most strategic and important in the world. Number 2, the political complexion of the Gulf is anarchic and requires the presence of an outside superpower, a policeman, to maintain interstate order, the absence of which has proven catastrophic to Western economic and political interests. Third, as we look toward the future, the superpower presence in the Gulf should involve an integrated alliance of Western and Arab states and their militaries, and be as small as possible, relying largely on naval presence backed up by an over-the-horizon fast reaction force located primarily in those smaller emirates whose leaders want and need a major superpower nearby as protection from their neighbors. And then fourth and finally, the West should be very careful about attempting to fundamentally change the nature of foreign societies. When London and Washington narrowly and carefully tended to their enduring national interests there, the preservation of interstate order and the continued free movement of trade in and out of the Gulf, they've succeeded. When they embarked on much larger quests to fundamentally reshape some of these oldest societies in the world, they stumbled. Sometimes at great expense, and some would say with tragic consequences.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we've heard 3 different perspectives on the Arab world, the UK and the US, and very much a sense of the regional order unraveling, of uncertainty of the limits of Western influence, but at the same time, some reasons why perceptions that the US is dramatically pulling back from the region may be overstated. We have now 25 minutes for final questions and comments. I see lots of hands. Let's start over here with Omar, please. Just behind you. Sorry, just behind you there. Waving.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to the panelists.
And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to those that don't know you.
Omar Siri, Research Assistant in the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House. My question is to Professor Makiya. You referenced the breaking down of the Arab state order, and we don't see, or you didn't prognosticate how that would turn out. Referencing 1967-68, and it harkens back to Sadiq al-Azam's kind of self-critique to me in terms of what you're referencing. My question to you is, in critiquing and criticizing political culture in the Arab world, how do you mitigate the perception, perhaps in the West, that develops into, to me it's a slippery slope, where you can very easily get into more of a racist commentary towards political culture in the Arab world, where democratization can't really take hold, or democracy can't really take hold. Do you mitigate that by the fact that, as an Iraqi, that criticism comes from you, and therefore it's more of a legitimate criticism? So that would be my question, and then I guess I'd also really like to hear the other two panelists, particularly because, to Professor Macris, you, in referencing the states that desire a superpower presence in the Middle East, you referenced states that, I believe all of which you referenced, wouldn't be considered democracies. So who is actually requesting or desiring that superpower presence, I think, is perhaps more of the outstanding question that maybe you can address.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple more questions before we come back to the panel. If you can bring a microphone up to Haider here.
Haider Kowi from the Center for Academic Shia Studies. I feel slightly bad about asking this question following historical analysis that stretches back hundreds of years and the lessons that can be learned from history. But my question is to Professor Makiya, and it's a counterfactual question. Jane spoke about the rise in social media and the interconnectedness that we now see that transverses borders. If Saddam was still in power today, would he have been able to stop this revolution in communications? Secondly, had he stayed in power, would the Arab Spring have reached Iraq? And if so, how would it have played out? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one question here.
Roger Hardy, King's College London. I think one of Iraq's misfortunes 10 years on is that our political leaders, and I think Gareth Stansfield said this, that the political leaders in Washington simply want Iraq to go away. And that is part of the legacy. Iraq has acquired a stigma akin to that of Suez, 1956 in this country, akin to Vietnam in the United States. And whatever Iraqis feel about Iraq, and we've heard a lot of Iraqi views about that, that is the dominant perception in the West. I'm not referring here, I think, to the Foreign Office or the State Department. They know that Iraq is still here and links into all the problems of the Middle East. It's our political leadership for whom Iraq has become an ugly word. They don't want anything they do to be associated with Iraq because that will damage them. And let me just add, as a journalist who's been a journalist for 30 years, the press too has decided that Iraq should go away. The media in this country and in the United States dropped Iraq like a brick, and I'm ashamed.
Thank you. Kanan, can we start with you?
Okay. Well, let me take first Omar's point. I cannot control the misuse that other people make of one's work or one's words. It seems to me our primary obligation as intellectuals, as writers, as commentators, is to speak the truth, irrespective of how that truth may be abused by others. If I have the opportunity to challenge a racist interpretation of one of my comments, I will take it up. But by and large, my first and primary obligation is to describe things as they are. So if I write a book called Republic of Fear, and if the Bush administration chooses to use this book, the book of which had nothing in it about the West or about the United States by and large, my primary obligation is, my primary question that I should be asking myself is what I described in the book correct, or is it not? Did I fail? Everything else is outside my control. You know, and I think that applies to the comments I would make earlier. This idea that we ought to be worried all the time how other people will misrepresent what we say is a fundamental undermining of the intellectual enterprise as I see it, and of any critical intellectual enterprise. So I mean, that would be my answer. To Haider, I simply don't know. The answer to the question, would Saddam have been able to stop something like the spread of the internet and so on in Iraq? I doubt it. But would there have been an Arab Spring in Iraq? I don't know. But I can say that in spite of the unsavory nature of most of the regimes in the area, I argued back in that old book that's now 25 years old, that something exceptionally nasty had happened in Iraq, something that stood apart from the nastiness that even exists in a country like Syria or other countries, something truly special. Right or wrong, again, my answer to the gentleman follows on from that. That's for others to judge. But therefore, I just don't know. I do know that I do know that when the Iraqi people rose up in 1991, we haven't talked about that. What are the numbers now for Syrian dead? 70,000, 90,000? Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, easily 200,000 dead in 1991 in the crushing of the uprising that followed the first Gulf War. Who talked about that? In answer to my colleague, the gentleman here, there are questions that are outside the internal stability of state systems. Questions like, what do you do when the state systems themselves, because of their own internal dynamics, gobble up other states? Well, the United States chose to intervene. Not really a matter of maintaining the order. It did want to restore the order. But then what do you do when, as a result of restoring the order and leaving Saddam Hussein in power, he butchers 200,000 Iraqis who thought these people were going to help them? Rightly or wrongly is another question. And he butchers 200. You're sitting there. You've got armies massed there. You are now under an incredibly difficult moral obligation. Do you do something or do you not do something? I mean, 200,000 people is not a small number. This is following on from the dilemma that Rosemary Hollis mentioned earlier. This is a real question that has to be addressed. It's not an easy question, and there are no, easy answers. But, in a sense, the answer, and I think the answer of the whole question of intervention is really about something that perhaps you didn't address, is always something that's certainly, policymakers don't and politicians hardly ever do, but the question is always a moral one. And that's the question we face in Syria today. Can you, as a human being, can we, as outsiders, stand by as hundreds of thousands of innocent people are cut down? I don't know. Maybe we can. Maybe we should. Are we going to know what the consequences of our own actions are? Of course not. The very nature of politics is that we don't know the answers to these questions. But there's right and wrong here are very complex questions and not easy ones to address. So that would be, I agree with Roger. Comments about the media and Iraq. But
thank you. Rosie?
2 points, actually, and I will be very careful because, actually, I would like to take Professor Macris on a couple of his statements, especially about this structurally anarchic region. And I would like to know whether Europe was structurally anarchic and whether the colonial rush to divide up Africa made it structurally anarchic, whether the anarchic elements in the structure of the Persian Gulf region owe anything to the imperial quest to nibble away at the Ottoman Empire and carve out little bits of it for themselves over 3 or 4 centuries. And I would also like to remind that the small footprint of Pax Britannica in the 19th century was owing to the fact that the Indian Army and Navy were what gave the British credibility in the Persian Gulf. And it was when they left India in 1947 that the British knew very well their time was up. They were living on bluff from 1947 until 1971 in the Gulf because they weren't capable of deploying a very large force, naval or army. You know, I really have trouble with this idea that you are going to rescue this region from its structural anarchy with a nice small footprint and a benign superpower over the horizon, because it seems to me like a justification of the status quo.
To a degree that the status quo represents what has been in place since 1991, since the American arrival at the end of 2 decades of bedlam where there was not a superpower maintaining order there. Yes, I think it does, to a degree, represent a maintenance of the status quo. A relatively small naval presence.
Status quo when?
Status
Pre-Saddam,
quo,
post-Saddam?
Well, since 1991, in my opinion, we need to dismiss, for this discussion here, 2003 from this discussion, but there has been a naval footprint backed up with the threat of a much larger force arriving from over the horizon. It does, in fact, look similar to the British system in the 1800s and 1900s, where you had a small squadron deploying from Bombay that showed the flag, showed the force, always with the British Army over the horizon ready to come. Now, I'm agnostic as to whether that's the way it should be or not. I don't necessarily think that morality is playing a large role in whether or not a superpower ought to be there or not. The lesson learned from the 2 decades of bedlam from 1971 until 1991 is that when the superpower left, the neighborhood fell apart.
Okay, I've got to stop.
Yeah?
But I will also mention the question about democracy and demands for
at the back as well.
For a superpower. Excellent. Well, we'll take, but I just wanted to pick up on that question about the smaller states that are seeking superpower presence being with mixed levels of democracy.
I think to address Omar's question, I might relate an interesting story that I uncovered in the British Archives in Kew. Shortly after the British announcement in January 1968 that they were going to pull the plug on the British military presence in the Gulf and their political overlordship of the region, there's an interesting passage from British ambassadors relating that the Arab leaders at cocktail parties in London were pleading with them to stay and were willing to offer financial incentives both to London and to Washington to stay, to keep their military there. And it's not surprising in that the Kuwaitis then, as now, are somewhat unsettled with their neighbor to the north. The Bahrainis, up through the 1970s, feared that Iran was going to claim them. It wasn't until a UN-led fact-finding mission in the 1970s that ended. Qatar has a tense relationship with the Saudis now. The UAE, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, had an unsettled border in the Bahraini border dispute, along with the Omanis. So these small states that have border disputes with their neighbors and have reason to fear the larger regional powers will not publicly stand up and say, we want Washington, we want London. That's not going to happen. You're not going to hear it. But will there be a quiet willingness to answer the requests for the Western-led coalition forces to use their facilities? I suspect they will, as they have and will continue to do.
Thank you. We've got time for one more round of questions, so we'll take lots. If you'll bring a microphone to Gareth here at the front. Yes, I can't see him. He's there, he is.
I have two questions. I'll make them quick. One is for Kanan. I have to say that Cruelty and Silence, I think, is one of the most outstanding books looking at Arab political opinions, and I recommend it to my students who are in the back corner over there, that they should read it. But I want to talk about Republic of Fear. Our mutual Iraq watcher, Toby Dodge, has recently published a book on new authoritarianism in Iraq, looking at the Nouri al-Maliki. I'm not going to ask you whether you think Nouri al-Maliki is a dictator. I don't think we really know enough about him to say that. But I'd like to ask whether you think that the construct of the Iraqi state is somehow predisposed to authoritarianism taking hold. And the second question to Jeff. I have to say, if you're an American policymaker looking at the Gulf ahead, would you not just say, so what? And by that, is it really that important anymore going forward? America is reducing its dependency upon Gulf oil. Indeed, Gulf oil is now going more towards the Far East, a million barrels a day over to China. Why would they want to locate there going forward? The British may have a residual interest, but really that's not terribly important. I mean, could you not imagine a situation emerging whereby the Gulf becomes increasingly marginalized in international affairs, perhaps balanced, dare I say it, by some form of WMD proliferation, mutually assured destruction, and all of those sorts of doctrines come back in a regional setting once Iran gets control of its, once Iran has a screwdriver-ready weapon. Is that not a more plausible scenario for an administration that is already, it's already pivoted? I mean, the Obama pivot has swung them possibly out to the Far East, leaving the Middle East also empty of Americans, perhaps.
Thank you very much. If you could take the microphone right to the back row where the British ambassador is sitting with all Gareth students, I think.
Thank you very much, Jane. Simon Hollis, British ambassador in Baghdad and previously in Damascus. And it's a question for Rosemary, really. You said that the Arab Spring showed that Arabs don't put up with tyrants forever. We know that the main lesson which the regime in Damascus took from Libya was that Gaddafi wasn't violent enough, he didn't hit hard enough, heavily enough, and their policy has shown that. And so I'd like to put to you, in light of your comments, and in light of the general tendency always to judge present conflicts by reference to the last one, always fight the last conflict or refight the last conflict, when we're looking at current situations. I'd like to put to you a question that was put to me by a Syrian activist in, I think it must have been late April or early May of 2011. The body count at that time was 2,000, so I guess it would have been about that time. And she said to me, you've made clear, Ambassador, and you've explained your government's policy to me, and you've referred to the need not to raise people's expectations unduly if you can't fulfill them, because I'd spoken to her about what had happened after 91, when people thought that in Iraq, when they thought that they'd been called to rise up, and they did, and they were chopped down. So I was very carefully managing her expectations. And she said to me, okay, it's 2,000. Will you give me the same answer when it's 20,000? Will you give me the same answer when it's 200,000? Which was the number that I noticed Professor Kanan mentioned. At current rates, that number will be reached sometime in the second half of this year. And I think it is a question that does have to be faced. As Professor Kanan said, there are no easy options. If there were, we'd have taken them by now. There are no easy options, but it's not a question that can be ducked. And I'd like to know what your answer is in light of what you said earlier. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If you could come up to the gentleman here.
Yeah, Duncan Fraser, University of Exeter. I was just wondering, Professor Macris, you talked about how a small naval footprint will produce less resentment in the region. I'm just wondering if in places like Bahrain, if a continual naval presence is seen as one of the reasons that we might back regimes like this, whether this may not lead to, the same backlash we've seen elsewhere. And if that not root out like the benefits of a small footprint?
Thank you. And the lady just behind him, please.
Yeah, Suns Abbas, Iraqi Turkmen representative to UK. I just wonder, we have now a country who formed the government on the basis of sectarian ethnicity, and it's really clear that they have very fundamental disagreement between themselves since last election until now, and next year we are going to have parliamentary election. We don't have interior and defense secretary. I'm just wondering, is it, the British and American government's obligation toward Iraq to straighten the political process over there, especially after what we heard from the Gareth Stanfield there, that there is option for the Kurdistan to be separated from the Iraq, and it's not going to be easy, as Mr. Rashid has issued that there is sensitive issues like disputed areas. So we are facing another conflict. Maybe it will be in the future another conflict, and there's people in the middle is going to be defenseless without any arm. And is it going to be point out that is going to be another conflict in the area, and it needs to have another intervention from the British government and Unitedness? And the second question,
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so we'll just take that one question. Thank you. And if you could bring the microphone up to Louis here. Sorry, but we're coming very close to the end. So we'll take one question from Louis, one question from Faisal, and then come back to our panelists.
Thank you. My question to Macris. 15 years ago, Hollywood produced a fictional movie about an asteroid hitting planet Earth. Now, the fiction part of it was not the asteroid. It was, at that time, the President of the United States was played by Morgan Freeman, a black American. 10 years later, we had Barack Obama running for election and to become a president, and with the middle name Hussein. Surely, like over two and a half centuries, nobody played or attempted to disfigure the evolution of democracy in the United States. Now, in your historical account, you mentioned the various milestones and how the Anglo-Americans kind of like played their episode in the Middle East, specifically in the Arabian Peninsula, of which clearly disfigured the history, and eventually now we are, whatever you want to call it, Arab Spring, but it's an ugly anarchy state across the region. If we had no involvement from the Anglo-American, could you envisage a better state or even a superpower in the Middle East instead of this mess? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take it back here.
Thank you. Kanan, you mentioned cruelty and silence, in which you took on some intellectual giants such as Edward Said and Abdurrahman Munif, and accused them, in essence, if I've read your work correctly, of sort of a complicity through silence in the through a failure to criticize Saddam Hussein in the regime's atrocities. Complicity may be too strong a word, but I don't have time to find exactly the right word. I have to say, and I say this with great respect, but it seems to me that you yourself have been silent over the ethnic cleansing of Baghdad, or at least you have not adequately addressed that issue in your writings, and of the sectarian violence in Baghdad, where people were killed if their name was Ali or Umar by the opposing, if they were perceived as Sunnis or Shiites by the opposing militias. And I just wonder how you square that, and whether you feel that it's appropriate, in fact, particularly because of the role you played in 2002 and early 2003 and prior to that, whether you think that it would be appropriate, in fact, to have taken a more public stand in criticizing and in commenting upon the ethnic sectarian violence in Iraq, and whether you feel you ought to address that at least. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll take one last question from Dr. Zuhair over here in the second row. Sorry, you'll just bring you a microphone. Thanks.
Thank you. The question to Professor Rosemary
Hollis, is you said that if we were about saving lives, then Iraq would not have been invaded, but lives were being lost in their thousands during the regime of Saddam, but no one knew about it. Lives were being lost. So my question is, how does one configure that? Lives were being lost all the time. The intervention stopped loss of life, but there was loss of life for other reasons. So it's a difficult one, but how would you qualify that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry we can't take more questions. We'll just spend a few extra minutes taking some answers from our panelists, perhaps starting with you, Rosie.
Thanks very much. And they are searing questions, these two, to me, from the ambassador, and now just here. Listen, I think we have been complicit in the periods when the killing was not overt. I think from 1971, to take a date, the enjoyment of the oil boom bonanza in the Gulf, the arrangements with the regimes, the kind of sense that, you know, stability is best served by these traditional rulers. And Baghdad is the kind of place it is because that's the kind of place Iraq is. And there's the same kind of complacency before Mubarak was toppled. You know, we try to suggest there's less torture in the jails, and they tell us, go worry about our own terrorists. Don't, and we'll mind our business, thank you very much. So we've been there all along in some shape or form. It's not like we stand back, let everybody get on with their own thing, and then occasionally, when the killing gets too bad, have a moral dilemma as to whether to intervene or not. We've been in the lead-up in one way or another. I argued in an article before the invasion that we were already responsible for keeping Saddam in power because of the perverted effect of the sanctions regime, and that the wrong people were suffering. I argued that we owe it to the Iraqi people, and that intervention, if not legal, for goodness sake, what do we call what we're doing through the UN in terms of the sanction regime, if not intervention in the lives of Iraqis? So we have to take it a step further. But if you remember, the whole operation, I remember in the margins of one of those Any Questions programs or Question Time programs, asking a member of the British government at the time, why don't you say it's to rescue the Iraqis from a heinous situation? We can't. It's not legal. And then if we said, what's going to happen on the day after? Ought there not to be more preparation for what happens post a regime change? The answer was, we must keep alive the possibility that Saddam believes he can get out of an invasion if he does the right thing by WMD. So where was this? There was no clarity on whether it was for the Iraqi people. And a massive loss of life afterwards. So I think, A, that, and B, I think, picking up a point made earlier, one must weigh the moral dilemma all the time. Weigh the moral consequences of supporting dictators and selling them arms and buying their oil and turning a blind eye to their prisons. Weigh the moral dilemma of going into a place like Iraq and now Syria in terms that the just war theorists, the theologians and philosophers have been debating for hundreds of years. We aren't without tools to weigh this, the exact amount of force that you can bring to bear. How far can you see through the consequences of a regime change in Syria? And when it comes to Syria, I mean, at what point do you want the ambassador to pose the dilemma? We've been on the journey for a long time, and if we stop the clock now and say, there's been enough killing, we now have to intervene, I think before we do that, we have to have a sensible plan that suggests that by military intervention, either by arming, overtly arming the Syrian resistance, or by deploying as to the extent perhaps that was done in Libya. What's the game plan? What's the end plan? Do we know what consequences will follow from helping one side in this civil war win? And can we say, with hand on heart, that the shambles that Iraq turned out to be will not be repeated? We probably can't, but I don't think it's as simple as saying once the death toll gets high enough, we can't avoid but intervene. We should intervene if we can do something. But if we can't, and we can't honestly say that we're going to make anything any better for anybody, we're simply going to have a role in the fight, then that's a different question.
Thank you. Final thoughts from you, Jeff?
I think regarding Gareth's question about whether the U.S. should stay in the Gulf, I think the U.S. finds itself today regarding the Gulf in a similar position that the British found in the late 1960s. In an era of constrained military budgets, where are the budget priorities? Where are the military priorities? And it's very clear that within the past several months, the U.S. Defense Department has enunciated a policy of tilting its emphasis toward further to the east in Asia, notably in China, North Korea, Japan. So is there a scenario where the U.S. could disengage much more deeply from the Gulf region than the naval footprint backed up with the threat of a fast reaction force coming later? There is. I don't think it's probable, but there is. And I think the lesson of the British withdrawal and the power vacuum that they left in 1971 and the troubles that ensued should offer a very sobering lesson of what should happen in the absence of that power. Regarding Bahrain, the United States finds itself in the dilemma that the West finds itself in all throughout the nations of the Arab Spring. The challenge between reconciling ideals and interests. And that naval base at Bahrain has been home to Western naval force for over 150 years. And to lose that strategically located position right in the middle of the Gulf would be something that would be very, very difficult to replace. So that enduring challenge between reconciling ideals and interests continues. And finally, what would have happened had the West not taken down the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago? I think we'll probably have to wait for the 100-year retrospective of World War I, which undoubtedly is coming next year.
Thank you. And Kanan, final thoughts from you.
Yep. Very quickly on Gareth's question, I haven't read Toby Dodge's books. I've seen it just come out. But on the issue of Maliki versus Saddam, I think the fundamental event that has happened in Iraq is that power has been fractured, broken up. We have not one Saddam, but hundreds of Saddams. And we don't have a change in the way of thinking about power. Maliki is one of those Saddam. So, and by the way, this poses a problem for the project that you were talking about earlier. It's very important. I like the way you put it, foreign policies, Iraq as the subject or the object. But what if the question is before that? The question is, what is Iraq? What if the question is, does Iraq is there a political identity called Iraq, to which large enough numbers of people and to which a political leadership connected with? There should be, and what is the substitute for that? So before you can even have a foreign policy, it's no wonder they don't have a foreign policy. They just react to events. It's for that reason. They don't know who they are, politically speaking. I mean, and the country is in a mess. Which brings me to Faisal's observation about cruelty and silence. I have not written, he's absolutely right, any substantial work since The Rock, which was about something else, but not quite, which is not about Iraq. And Ben part, I'll be quite honest, it's, I have tens of thousands of words that I don't like, can't publish. It's very hard. I'm finding it very hard. I had a focus when Saddam was around. It was easy to write when Saddam was around. There's now 1,000 Saddams, as I said earlier. It's hard to know where to start. Sectarianism, oh, I've spoken about that hundreds of times, profiles, interviews, this, that, and the other. So my views on the sort of horrific nature of the sectarian strife that's going on the fault of all the main leaders and all the main players of the whole political class that's formed in Iraq are wide enough known. But I have not written, you're right, a substantial work, because I have not yet found the right form in which to write that work. I know what I want to say, I don't know how to say it. It may be connected to some of the things I just said, but I'm frankly admitting. Secondly, there's such a thing as being too close to events. I was a participant. I never served in government. I deliberately never served in government or in anything remotely resembling government. So I never, but I was, you're right, I didn't write anything substantial, and it is a question I ask myself every day, and I will rectify it one of these days. So on that note,
thank you, and I just want to say a few final thank yous to everybody who came. A special thanks to the Foreign Office, to Shell, to the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, who are having their own conference on Britain and the occupations of Iraq on September 11th this year, to the UNDP Iraq, and to the Al Nahrain Centre for Strategic Studies in Baghdad, who have travelled over here especially to be with us, which has been wonderful. I want to thank our Chatham House team, Omar Siri, Sophie Grant, Helen Twist, Sarah Masri, and Ghazwan Al-Dafai for all their work making the event run smoothly, and Nusayba Yunus, who chaired the second panel from the Harvard Kennedy School, as the very idea of having this conference was hers in the first place. We will continue to debate and discuss Iraq here. We have a special issue of International Affairs this month and of The World Today, and a collection of resources on our website, if you wouldn't mind taking a look. And it just remains for me to thank all of the speakers, and to you for coming. Please join me in thanking our final panelists.